Hey everyone, my name is John West. I guess I was a little bit too eager to get up here, so sorry. Sorry for interrupting Tone. But I have the honor of introducing our next guest, and that is John Rizzo, who is the editor of Bitcoin Magazine. I'm sorry, Pete Rizzo, and editor at large for Kraken. And I think more importantly, Pete has become well known as a Bitcoin historian. And he has some other important credentials. So, like many of us, Pete has stuck with Bitcoin through thick and thin. And for most of us, that means putting up with Bitcoin FUD and volatility, which I admit is no small feat. But Pete has also been one to endure a lawsuit from a previous employer. And Pete was simply doing his job. He was writing about Bitcoin, and they thought after he left them that had damaged their reputation, and so they went after him. It worked out, but it just goes to show, how much hate there was, and even still is with Bitcoin, and how some of the Bitcoiners endure some of that for us. I think another important thing about Pete, and critical for a journalist historian, is, and I think it's even most underappreciated, is I see Pete really demonstrate um, to constantly challenge his Bitcoin assumptions or previous conclusions. Pete will say this: Bitcoin is still young. We all know that Bitcoin is still very young, and no one completely understands it. And Pete understands that he doesn't understand it, and he can teach us that as well if we allow him to do so. So Pete formally started his Bitcoin journey in 2013, blogging for Coinbase. And he's essentially been a Bitcoin journalist historian for more than 10 years. And the phrase, those who don't learn from history are doomed comes to mind because Bitcoin has a long history, more than 15 years. Really, when you start studying Bitcoin history, it goes back 40 plus years. And there's a lot there. And so I think we can learn a lot from Bitcoin history, and we can learn a lot from Pete. So this is a great presentation to pay attention to. So with that, please help me welcome Pete Rizzo.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Wow. Hard act to follow there. Thank you out in the crowd for remembering my name. Where's the, okay, here we go. We got the monitor down here. All right. This is the last one before lunch, so we got to make it good. So this is Bitcoin history in 21 pictures. Got to reintroduce myself a little bit. Bitcoin historian on Twitter. You may have seen my stuff. I've been a journalist since 2013. What do? I conduct archival research about Bitcoin. So I attempt to go into the archives and available information and study the people and events that shaped it, right? Bitcoin is a technology, it's evolving in real time, and it's continuing to develop. And I think it's important that we understand this pantheon of people who have contributed ideologically and personally to what is being created. And as John mentioned, I was agnostic about Bitcoin for a long time, right? So I joined in the industry in 2013, and I didn't really develop a strong conviction about Bitcoin until late 2017. And a lot of my conviction was based on seeing Bitcoin endure through events, enduring through attempts to change it, and seeing different actors and parties attempt to have their way with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin remaining the lone cryptocurrency that was able to withstand those kind of attacks. And I consider myself a Bitcoin maximalist. I have my own definition for that. I've written about that. I'm someone who wants to further Bitcoin and I think eliminate the crypto system and its issues. All right, so Bitcoin history. Why 21 pictures? We're going to attempt to speed run the entire 15-year Bitcoin history in 25 minutes. All right, so you average that out, it's about a minute a year. So pictures say a lot. So this is a Bitcoin price chart. And this is how I divide the Bitcoin history. I divide it into epochs, right? So essentially chunks of time around Bitcoin halvings where we've seen the price go up over time, right? And so what does this picture say? Bitcoin has generally gone up over time, and we expect that to continue. All right, so we're going to take a Bitcoin time machine. We're going to go back in time. There's the DeLorean. We're going to start in 2009 to 2013, the first epoch. How many people here joined Bitcoin back in 2009 to 2013? How many real old timers we got? Okay. Appreciate those with good OPSEC who kept their hands down. I'm sure we've got a lot of legends out there. So okay, we're gonna start there. All right, the first picture. So this is an email from Satoshi Nakamoto on the cryptography mailing list. Not a lot to look at. Bitcoin, while it started with high aspirations, it really starts with some text on a piece of paper, right? With the Bitcoin white paper. This is not an image of that. This is an image of Satoshi Nakamoto unveiling the supply schedule for Bitcoin. So we're coming up on the Bitcoin halving, and him introducing the 21 million coin limit. So something to realize about Satoshi is that he was building on the failures of others, right? He was part of a movement of digital technologists, the cypherpunk movement, who were seeking to create a working digital cash. And this is a effort that really began in the 1980s. So the first kind of person who envisioned that a digital cash would be possible or desirable was David Chaum. So he was a cryptographer of that era, and he really was concerned about the creeping computerization of the world. Right, the web then, or the internet back then, was something small. It was on campuses, maybe professors. You were using it to send emails, but it wasn't widespread. It hadn't permeated everyday life. And David Chaum was part of a group that saw the coming issues that we're facing today: databases that house our personal information, an internet and where the gatekeepers require our information in order to do things, right? And they were very concerned about our rights, our values, how they'd be enshrined in this world. And for all intents and purposes, David Chaum creates a working digital cash. Digital cash was invented in the 1980s, and there are digital caches before Bitcoin. His design, however, was not decentralized. It was operated by a central mint, and it was operated by merchants. Essentially, merchants and banks controlled the system. And there was a group of people who were dissatisfied with that. One, because David Chaum wanted to commercialize his technology and sell it to banks, but also because it wasn't available. They were waiting for David to release his patented innovation. This group was the cypherpunks, and they, in their dissatisfaction, decided to follow their own motto and write code. So they sought to create decentralized alternatives, right? They wanted to avoid David's patent. They didn't like his model, so they wanted something else. And there was a series of attempts to create different projects that all failed. The third wave of that would have been Adam Back, this idea that hash cash, we can back a digital cash with computing resources. Maybe we don't want to back a digital cash with something like a physical cash or gold. Maybe we can back it with computer science and use that to create a working digital cash. And it's really these things that Satoshi brings together, right? Satoshi does build on these failures, but he puts together pieces that were already there. And I think the most important original contribution that Satoshi had was the economic qualities of the Bitcoin economy. Bitcoin has succeeded over time, it's endured over time, and that is because of its economic programming. And that really is the piece that Satoshi adds, right? So, Bitcoin continues to work. We can continue to improve it because it continues to work. And this alone is sort of separated from the prior digital cash projects. We're going to do a lot of show of hands here. This one's a gimme. How many of you are familiar with who's in this picture? Okay, got a lot of hands. It wasn't everybody, so we got some more studying to do. So this is Hal Finney and his wife Fran. Hal was very important to the Bitcoin history because he was really Satoshi's first champion. He was part of the cypherpunk groups of California that I was referring to in the 1990s. And he too shared many of these concerns that David Chaum had. But unlike many of the other cypherpunks who on this mailing list, they poked holes in Satoshi's idea. They said it couldn't work because it required too much energy. It would be attacked by bots. It would never gain value. Hal is distinguished because he's the lone optimist. And I like to say that I don't believe that Hal was Satoshi, and that improves his story. Because if Hal is not Satoshi, he's someone who spent his entire life seeking to achieve what Satoshi achieved. And then when faced with the realization that someone else achieved that, rather than become disenchanted, rather than becoming jaded, rather than becoming jealous, he chose to throw the full weight of his human passion and energy behind Bitcoin. And the first post that he offers to the mailing list is one of optimism, one of saying, hey, we can try this, we can work. And it goes so far as to him suggesting, as many of you know and have seen on Twitter today, his price predictions that if Bitcoin became the entire world economy and captured that value, a coin would be worth $10 million. And right that's an aspiration today for us to grow the economy then, but Hal realized that we should view Bitcoin with optimism. I think his story continues to invite us to do that. But of course, he was not with the project long. Unfortunately, he succumbed to ALS and was eventually diagnosed, and his contributions with Satoshi were brief. Okay, picture number 2. How many people are familiar with this image? Show of hands. I'm going to stump everybody. We got one person. All right, so Bitcoin was working. People were running the software, but Bitcoin didn't have value. Bitcoins were worthless. In fact, they were worse than worthless because you had to spend money to get them. So people who were acquiring Bitcoin at that point, paying for the electricity, you could argue they were losing money by acquiring Bitcoin. They were acquiring Bitcoin at a loss. So along came this anonymous Bitcoin legend who went by the name New Liberty Standard. And he did something really interesting. He said, hey, I'm mining all these Bitcoins on my laptop. I wonder if I can sell them to somebody and what are they worth? So he performs the first price calculations, right? He says, what is a Bitcoin worth? He asks the question and attempts to answer it. And an interesting quirk of history, he uses an argument about the labor theory of value. He's saying, hey, it took me this long to create these Bitcoins. This is how much I paid for electricity. And here's my calculation based on how much it costs for me to produce what I will accept. Interesting because we talk so much about Austrian economics and subjectivity, and Satoshi even comments himself that he believes in the subjective theory of value, and that while New Liberty Standards attempt might be a little bit misguided in in the ideology that it uses, it's useful, right? And the community rallies behind it, and the first trade is conducted in late 2009. 5,000 Bitcoins were sold for $5 using this pricing mechanism. He thought he was getting a pretty good deal. And we thank him, of course, for his contribution to the economy. All right. How many of you are familiar with this image? This guy's funny. He's on Twitter. He gets around. So we don't know who this is. This is an unknown early Bitcoin talk forum user who's one of the, just lost, his name is lost to time, but people were running software, people were valuing Bitcoins, but they wanted to demonstrate that, right? People wanted to spread the word about what Bitcoin was, and it was getting increasingly hard to mine Bitcoin, right? Many people were contributing. Even if you had a laptop and you were willing to dedicate it, it wasn't easy. So this young man decided that he would accept a bounty that was posted on Bitcoin Talk. He accepted around 20 Bitcoins to go stand in the rain and hold this Bitcoin sign that says, "Stop the Fed, use Bitcoins." And this was met with great fanfare on the forums, and I think it speaks to the values of the time, right? This was a community that was small, it was niche, and it was looking to get out its name and its word however possible and however silly, as you can see with this man's choice of hat. I'm not sure if the hat was required or if he chose to wear that. That would be one of my questions for him, but we have these nice pictures of him going to evangelize Bitcoin. All right. How many people are familiar with this billboard? You've seen this billboard before. Got a couple hands. So now we're into late 2012, early 2013. So this was a famous billboard. This was really the first marketing effort that was made for Bitcoin. This was put up by an entrepreneur named Roger Ver, and he paid to put this sign up on the highway in Silicon Valley. So Bitcoin was now put in the face of venture capitalists, the people who were investing in new technology. And it was very much a period of time where Bitcoin was seeking the support of that group, right? Bitcoin was an exciting new technology. It needed support, it needed development, it needed investment. And they were looking to get this attention. And this investor was willing to kind of put his capital into doing that. And also, it shows just how ingrained Bitcoin was in the internet. The tagline here, the honey badger of money. This is a famous meme of the time. Honey badger don't care. Bitcoin, we wanted to position Bitcoin as something that would essentially continue to endure and continue to fight off attacks. And there was this perception that Bitcoin was doing that. All right, how many people are familiar with these two individuals here? Couple hands. So we have this wave of young entrepreneurs who comes to Bitcoin in 2013, and they come with pretty big ideas. There's a lot to unpack in this image. So this is Mr. Charlie Shrem and Yifu Guo, and they're in their WeWork office for a startup called BitInstant. They had raised some minor venture capital from a few people named the Winklevoss twins in order to get started. But here, Yifu is going to his friend Charlie and he's showing him his first ASIC miner that he produced. So this was the first specialized piece of mining equipment for Bitcoin. One of these retailed for about 90 to 100 Bitcoin if you had it at the time. And it was so powerful that it essentially could mine about a block a day. So you were mining about 25 Bitcoin with this machine. But Yifu had an interesting conundrum, right? He had to figure out what to do with these mining machines. He could have kept them all for himself and he could have mined all the Bitcoin. That would have been great for Yifu. Instead, he decided to start a business called Avalon that sold them directly to consumer. His idea was that with this power, he had responsibility and he needed to distribute these mining machines to as many people as possible. And so he did that. The company unfortunately failed. They weren't able to deliver on the promise of those machines. Many people lost money, but Yifu decided to return that, and there's a nice redemption arc there. Charlie, that we can't say much about him and have to move on, also had a similar fate. BitInstant, though, was the way that many people acquired their first Bitcoin. Charlie was arrested for helping facilitate money laundering on the Silk Road and served 2 years in prison. So, and again, a tragic tale to some of these early entrepreneurs, but they certainly helped push the economy forward. How many people are familiar with this photo? Okay, nobody. We got one guy because I think you were an employee back, right? So this is the BitPay Bitcoin Bowl, the St. Petersburg Bitcoin Bowl. This is of an American football stadium. BitPay was the sponsor. So payments, again, were riding the narrative. Bitcoin was becoming mainstream, but Bitcoin at this point had achieved cultural penetration. Magazines were writing about it. News outlets were writing about it. People were aware of it, right? And this was national television. This was two college football teams ending their season to millions of national viewers with a Bitcoin logo on the field. I was there myself and I reported on that. But I think it speaks to the time and the aspirations of it hadn't quite penetrated, right? I went out and spoke to merchants in St. Petersburg. None of them had heard of it. But again, Bitcoin was seen as successful. It was seen as entering the global conversation. And it was, again, seen as something that had emerged and from a fringe element to become part of the tech mainstream. You guys got to know this one. A painful image for some. So this is a fellow named Mark Karpelis. You might know this from the meme, "In this moment, I am euphoric." So here he is not euphoric. Mr. Mark Karpelis is actually being dragged before a court to declare bankruptcy for his exchange Mt. Gox. He had actually just been hacked and had his exchange taken offline because it was insolvent, and he had lost 750,000 Bitcoin on behalf of his customers. The story of that today is that some of those people have finally been repaid, but it was a painful lesson for the community. The price declined precipitously from over $1,000 to under 600, would eventually fall to a low of 200. The media disappeared, the investors disappeared. Bitcoin was no longer cool. We had lost money, we had lost the trust of the consumer public in many regards. And the community had to face the fact that many people were not using self custody. Back then, the best storage options we had for Bitcoin was printing out a piece of paper, sending it to a QR code, and laminating it. That was the advice of people like Andreas, because those were the tools of the time. So Bitcoin enters a period of uncertainty, and we enter the second epoch. We're going to make it. We're going to make it. We're going to speed run this. Picture number 8. So this is a fellow by the name of Gavin Andreessen. And here he is at Bitcoin 2014, which is in many ways a pivotal conference in the industry. He's with a young reporter from CoinDesk named Rui Ma in the back. Just a little billionaire named Brian Armstrong with his vest for a startup called Coinbase. So why is Gavin dressed like a mad scientist? Well, he was actually accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award, the Blockchain Awards, on behalf of Satoshi Nakamoto. So why was Gavin doing that? Gavin was the developer who took over from Satoshi and inherited the title of lead developer from Satoshi. And he managed the project, he managed the developers, he set the course, he set the vision. And Gavin saw himself as very much needing to step up and needing to put forward a positive vision for how Bitcoin could continue to improve, how it could continue to get back to the heights that it saw and gain more users. And he would do that through a series of very controversial technical proposals. I'm sure you've heard of Bitcoin Classic. I'm sure you've heard of Bitcoin XT. You might not understand the context. These were his plans to hard fork Bitcoin. He wanted to continue what he thought was the vision of Satoshi Nakamoto by scaling Bitcoin through raising the block size. This would increase the transaction throughput and how much speed for payments Bitcoin could process. And he felt very strongly that the way for Bitcoin to succeed was to obtain regulatory clarity, was to become so successful and so widely used in commerce that governments couldn't crack down on it. This stood in stark contrast to a controversial other opinion put forth by a man named Peter Todd that the block size must remain small, that Bitcoin's best chance at withstanding government attacks was not to get regulatory approval, but it was to distribute the Bitcoin software and its operation as widely as possible, such that it couldn't be crushed by any governments, even if they were adversarial. And that sets up the early split within the block size wars. Number 9, this is a picture from a white paper. This is called the Sidechains white paper. This was released by a company called Blockstream, founded by a man named Adam Back, as well as some of the principal core developers of the time. They too had a vision for how Bitcoin could move forward amidst this time of uncertainty. And it was to assimilate and provide the features of the cryptocurrency economy within Bitcoin, to essentially assimilate kind of everything that people were doing within the crypto economy on Bitcoin. A bit of a controversial take today, but you can see, again, this was a very mainstream idea at the time. The authors of this paper would have been people like Matt Corallo, Peter Woolley, of course, Adam Back, and they saw Bitcoin as a series of blockchains. You see a picture here. It says side chains. It says micropayments. It says R&D. They envisioned that there would just be blockchains where people were testing new things. They would lock Bitcoin in a contract, move it to something like a liquid, and experiment. And last but not least, you can see that it says side chains extensions. You have smart contracts, real world assets. They envisioned all of these things happening within Bitcoin. Number 10. So this is where we enter the really thorny parts of the fork wars. The name of this blog post and title, I'll read it, written by a name named Mirsha Popescu, is: if you go on a Bitcoin fork, irrespective of which scammer proposes it, you will lose your Bitcoins. Mirsha was a prolific blogger. He's really seen as the father of Bitcoin toxicity. And what is Bitcoin toxicity? It's this idea, because you run Bitcoin, your Bitcoin software. In this case, he had coded a Bitcoin software himself that was compatible with Bitcoin, his own implementation, that no one could tell him that he wasn't running Bitcoin. And in a series of blog posts, he essentially outlined an intellectual challenge. And he said, I've coded my own version of the Bitcoin software. I say these are the rules. I say this is Bitcoin. And I say that my value is Bitcoin. And if you, the collective core developers that are talking about hard forking, that are talking about scaling Bitcoin, decide to invalidate me, you'll have destroyed Bitcoin, because then Bitcoin is what you say it is and not what I say it is. And I, as an individual user, have to be able to define Bitcoin. Mirsha, a bit of a controversial figure to talk about. He also did things like put death threats on core developers and lived a life of excess and debauchery, of which we, really can scarcely understand, and passed away in 2021 as likely one of the richest people in the world, from what we can tell on the Bitcoin blockchain. All right, so now we have the real middle of the scaling wars. We have Gavin on one side, we have the developers and Bitcoin developers on the other side. They're all looking for ways to increase the throughput to Bitcoin. They want to raise the block size, right? Both sides in the block size wars want to raise the block size. They just have different ways of thinking about it. One wanted to enact a hard fork and force all users to upgrade. One wanted to enact a soft fork and give people the opportunity to peacefully do that when they chose. This would have been the conference where SegWit was proposed. Peter Woolley got on stage and he said, we can raise the block size with a soft fork. They expected this to be a big compromise and it to be greeted with excitement. It was not. It was largely misunderstood. On this stage here, we have a picture. This is 95% of the Bitcoin mining power at the time. 95% of the Bitcoin mining ecosystem represented in a single picture sitting on a single stage. And I'm sure you'll notice that most of them are Chinese. At that point, because of the business failures and the entrepreneurial failures in Bitcoin, mining chip production had really whittled down to two companies. There were two companies that hadn't failed. One was the name of Bitfury, and the other was Bitmain. And really, you had the emergence of a regional Chinese mining cartel. If you wanted to buy mining chips, if you wanted to get mining rigs to mine Bitcoin, you had to buy through Bitmain. And Bitmain was run by a young man named Jihan Wu. He felt very strongly that Bitcoin should raise the block size. He felt very strongly that Bitcoin should proceed on the path of scaling that he felt was right. And he exercised an incredible amount of force on this group of people, because essentially, in order to continue to do business, he would have the power to eliminate you if that's what he saw fit. And we have the game theory here of Bitcoin evolving on a scale where different factions are emerging with different interests and different powers and trying to exert their vision of what will happen with Bitcoin. You guys got to know this one. How many people have this hat? Okay, a couple people. So this is the UASF, user activated soft fork. Bitcoin was at a stalemate. The warring factions had essentially been unable to find a path forward. People wanted SegWit, people wanted hard forks. It wasn't clear what would happen. A group of people got together and released a proposal that the users should upgrade to Bitcoin themselves. The economic majority of the network, if they decided to upgrade Bitcoin, that it really wasn't the miners who were in control. We, the users who run nodes, we who accept payments, we who use Bitcoin can decide the future of Bitcoin. And they coded up their own software that said if SegWit is not activated by this date, we will fork off Bitcoin and activate it. In response to this, the businesses and miners cave. They essentially enact SegWit, and all plans to increase the block size via hard fork fail. The Bitcoin Cash blockchain splits. Here you can see the community celebrating these various divisions. On one hand, you have the Bitcoin core developers on the left. Some of them were not fans of the UASF, but certainly happy with the outcome. And on the right, Roger Ver, Craig Wright, and Calvin Ayre, who were celebrating the launch of Bitcoin Cash. But really, this was a story that was overshadowed. These are the hands of probably the most famous pop star of the time, Katy Perry. Sold more copies than Michael Jackson. These are her fingernails. And as you can tell, they're decorated with different cryptocurrencies. The world largely ignored this debate within crypto. It was the age of crypto assets. You were encouraged to have portfolios of cryptocurrencies. Investors were looking at the differences between each one, and this is personified here by her fingernails. She likely was somebody who was invested in doing all these things, and you know, that was the way that the mainstream saw our world. All right, 2018 to 2021. How many people here got into Bitcoin during this era? All right, it's good folks. It was a good era. We had fun. Starts with the Bitcoin Standard. Bitcoin Standard really marks the end of the fork wars, right? It's a book that consolidates and offers a positive vision for Bitcoin. Through these years of wars and infighting, people really didn't know if Bitcoin was going to succeed. We didn't know if it was going to fail. The Bitcoin Standard by Safety Namus offered a forward vision. It said, Bitcoin is an alternative to central banking. That alternative works today, and it stands in contrast to what's available. And I think from that sprung a whole ecosystem of bloggers and podcasts who really celebrated what Satoshi had achieved, right? The response that we went through as a community was to go back to the beginning, to ask why we were here and reevaluate the work of Satoshi and to discuss how we can move that forward. Of course, the book has another notable convert. This is Michael Saylor, who of course needs no introduction, with his laser eyes. Michael, in other ways, also ends the fork wars, right? Rather than diversify his investment into a number of cryptocurrencies, he decides to put the treasury of his company into Bitcoin. This sends a strong signal to the market that Bitcoin has triumphed, that the fork wars are over, and Bitcoin is ready to continue to advance and continue to triumph within the industry. And so I think it's important to remember that Michael came at that moment and really offered something that was very valuable within the lens of history. This is a funny one. Here we have a protest during the COVID lockdowns. These are two young ladies, and they have a sign that says, unvaccinated sperm is the next Bitcoin. But this was true, right? We saw during COVID a massive escalation in government and involvement in our lives. And for many during that period, Bitcoin became a lifeline. People were getting deplatformed. People were losing jobs. People were not allowed to make medical choices without consequences. And Bitcoin, a software that you could run, a money that you could accept, that nobody could confiscate your keys, became very attractive with that environment. And it began to be associated with a certain set of values and became politicized because this conversation around COVID was happening globally, and it was happening with people who had many different political ideas. Of course, not everything was happening in the West. We had the formation of a circular economy in a very important place. This is Bitcoin Beach in El Salvador. There's a woman making pupusas. And what was going on there was people accepting Bitcoin for commerce, merchants accepting it, a group that had established to, distribute Bitcoin to the community to see if they could create a circular economy. And it was a huge success. That success caught the interest of a podcaster named Peter McCormick. That his content caught the interest of an entrepreneur named Jack Mallers, who went to go and see what was happening. And very shortly, the president of a country was so convinced about Bitcoin's utility that it was enacted in a law in the formal congressional assembly within El Salvador to make Bitcoin legal tender. And again, it was Bitcoin and not any of the other cryptocurrencies. We're really moving now. But our message that Bitcoin is not crypto, I think, crescendos. We're not really able to convince everyone of this. Here we have Elon Musk, and he's tweeting some very confusing stuff, as Elon does. And I'll read these quotes because I think they're important. Block size and frequency should steadily increase to match available bandwidth. If we need to reach speed, and regulated exchanges will act as a second layer. But the perfect should not be any of the good. It's time to increase base layer transaction speed and lower base layer transaction costs. So despite our efforts to evangelize, some of the technical community, the Silicon Valley elements, still have technical questions about Bitcoin. In this case, Elon decided to support alternatives. He threw his weight behind Dogecoin. That has not been a great investment for the people who were involved. But for many people within that ideological set, they remain unconvinced. They remain optimistic that these other cryptocurrencies outside Bitcoin will grow in value, and they think they're valid. They believe that they're what they are doing in order to drive applications and get people to build on those tools are helping us discover the potential of what is possible with Bitcoin. This is underscored, I think, by the end of the 2021 cycle. You have who do they choose to put on the cover of Time magazine? It was not Satoshi Nakamoto, but we have Mr. Vitalik Buterin, the prince of crypto. And I think this sort of sums up where currently the mainstream views it, right? We've built this wall between the communities. It's Bitcoin and crypto, but we're still fighting for supremacy within the mainstream. We have a message, we have an ideology that's valid, but we're fighting for its approval, right? We're fighting for it to be considered the default way in which we look at the industry. All right, we got one more. Last picture. So 2022 to 2025, we hope that the pattern repeats. We hope that tone base is correct. We'll go all the way to the moon. So the last image that I'm going to focus on here is the mempool. So this is a image that I think a lot of you will be familiar with for checking the recent free rates. This is mempool.space. And so as many of you who use this have known, fees are high and getting higher. And why is that? Well, there's been a recent increase in the amount of interest from the crypto community in building on Bitcoin, building different protocols, building different technologies, migrating what they have, trying to salvage what they have, and moving it over to Bitcoin. And so I think the mempool will really be the battleground for the next era. I think you're seeing the party lines be drawn, but the questions that are emerged are valid. Who has the right to put a piece of data on the Bitcoin blockchain? Does that data have to be a certain thing? Do those ones and zeros have to be read in a certain way? Do I have to agree that they have value? What rights do I have as someone who stores this database to control what goes in it? Do I have the right to force that opinion on others? Do I have the right to make a change to what goes into it? And these are many of the questions that are being asked. And I think, while many people want or expect these questions to go away, I don't think that that is correct. I think we're a few weeks away from the launch of a dedicated meme coin protocol on top of Bitcoin. And these are the kind of things that will exacerbate the issue. But Bitcoin is a permissionless technology, and, cypherpunks write code. If you have an idea about how to change Bitcoin, you are always able to write a compatible piece of software and run it. Of course, users don't have to use it. All right, that's been my presentation. Pete Rizzo, Bitcoin historian. You can follow me on Twitter. Thanks for tuning in.